All right, let's welcome in our guest, David Rubenstein. David, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. We're going to spend some time on this episode really focusing in on leadership, and you're someone that has a wealth of knowledge in that area. So thank you so much for the time.
My pleasure to be here. I was hoping we would talk about basketball because that's what I want to know more about, but okay, leadership is fine.
Well, it's pretty clear from reading your book that you like to ask questions as well. So if you have any basketball-related questions, you can fire away. I did want to start in talking about Duke because Tommy and I joke all the time about the Duke Mafia, and the Duke network is sort of everywhere and in all fields. But you were at Duke pre-Coach K, and prior to my sort of understanding and knowledge and vision of what Duke is as this global brand. I think you graduated in 1970. So what was Duke like way back when, back in the 60s and early 70s?
To be very serious about it, Duke was a different university. Today, it's a global university, well recognized and generally consistently in the top 7, 8, 9 universities in the United States. And it has transformed itself because of a lot of things that have happened. When I went there, I entered in 66. Duke had only desegregated in 1963. So it was an all-white campus like other Southern universities, Rice, Emory, Vanderbilt, they were all segregated. So in my class, there were 5,000 people that applied to go join in my class. 3,000 got in, so it wasn't that hard to get in. 60% of the people applied got in. That's how I got in. It was a different university. In my class, there were 12 blacks. In my class, we didn't have any J.J. Redick superstar basketball players, to be honest. We had a very good basketball coach, Vic Bubas, and he got to the Final Four, but he never won the championship. But there had never been a black basketball player at Duke University at that time. The first black in the ACC was Charlie Scott, who played at UNC, and it was a big novelty at that time. So it was a different university, very fraternity-oriented. I wasn't in a fraternity. It was they had a Jewish quota. There was a quota of 5% of people who were Jewish. So it was a different university. It has transformed itself to be a great university, but at the time it was a regional university with a few people from the Northeast. That's really what it was.
How did you end up there, David?
I had no money, zero. My father didn't graduate from high school or college. He worked in the post office. So I went where I was an equal opportunity person. Whoever applied gave me the biggest scholarship. That's where I was going. So as I like to say, I was given a scholarship to Duke, but it was not a basketball scholarship. The only person ever cut from an intramural basketball team at Duke was me. And I only had 4 people on the team. So I wasn't a great athlete, but I went there because they gave me the money, the biggest amount of money, and I needed the money. So that's why I went there. And I had never been to the South before. And interestingly, I came from Baltimore, and when I got down there, they started making fun of my accent. You said, you have a funny accent. I said, what about you guys? I can't even understand you either. But it was a different school, a different university. Today, it's really been transformed over the last 50 years or so, but it's different than it was then.
Yeah, the recent Duke grads get sort of the negative global elitist tag labeled on us. That was not the Duke that existed when you were there. It certainly has changed. And how much of that, and obviously the university has invested a ton in a bunch of different areas all over academia and all over their athletic department, but how good has Coach K been for the university itself?
Well, Coach K has helped transform the university. It has a global brand in large part because of his success as a basketball coach, not just in winning championships or gold medals, but in trying to make young men into, citizens of the world. Remember, not everybody is going to play in the NBA. Even though a lot of the one and dones are NBA players in your era, you graduated and so forth, but most people playing on the Duke basketball team are just not going to be NBA players. And so he's worried about them as well as the people who are going to play in the NBA. And he's a really transformative person. So he's indispensable to the university's brand. And the fact that he's coaching at the age of 73 shows you that the university really loves him and what he's done. So he's been great for us. And the problem is who's going to succeed him. Remember, John Wooden's successor only lasted 2 years. And whoever is going to succeed him is going to have a tough time because you're succeeding a legend. So, but I think he's done an incredible job. He's an incredible individual, and I've gotten to know him reasonably well for a non-basketball person.
David, I was going to ask you. You obviously interview Coach for your new book. When did you get to know him, and when did you sort of start to figure out that he was different, than maybe a normal coach?
Well, of course, as you know, in his first 5 years, he had a losing record, and he thought he was going to get fired. But I got to know him well after I graduated, or well after he was there. Remember, I graduated in 70. I didn't really do anything related to the Duke until probably 2005. I gave them some money to build the building, and all of a sudden they then got me involved in the board, and I became the chairman of the board. While I was the chairman of the board, I did spend more time with him. I had interviewed him a couple times in business occasions before, but when I was the chairman of the board, I helped support some of his projects, and he was happy, and I got to know him reasonably well. And I don't call him all the time, but I'm sure I can reach him anytime I'd like. And he's an interesting interviewee because he's got a good story to tell. He's also an interviewer. When I interviewed him for my book, the condition was that he could interview me for his radio show. So we did a back-to-back and home, I guess, that day.
We recently had Coach on the podcast, and he has yet to ask me to come on his radio show. I've known him for over 20 years, and he's had this show. He's had this show for a long time, and I've yet to get the invite.
Tell David what Coach told you about you and the podcast.
Oh, so Coach called me in August, right after our team had been eliminated from the playoffs while we were in the bubble. And I didn't say this on his podcast, but I will say this now to you. I think he'd had a couple glasses of wine, and he called me and basically talked shit about my podcast. And because I had him on in 2016, and basically what he said was, I don't think your podcasting skills were worthy of a guest of my caliber. That's a butchering the quote, but that's essentially what he said.
Well, I'm sure he was just kidding you. But in any event, look, he's an unusual figure. He came from very modest circumstances and did a very good job at Duke. And, I hope he can stay another, X number of years. He's really good, and it's been good for the brand. So let me ask you a question, though. When you were considering going to college, did you consider any other colleges seriously other than Duke, or was Duke always the place you wanted to go?
Well, I grew up a Duke fan, and that's pretty well known. I had two other schools that I would have gone to if Duke had not existed. So I grew up mostly in Virginia. I loved UVA. We lived in Charlottesville for a portion of my childhood. It's a great university. And I felt some sense of loyalty to stay in state and go to UVA. And then the other school, which was like an up-and-coming program at the time, was Florida, and Billy Donovan was the coach. They had been to, I believe, the Final Four in the year 2000, so right around the time that I was making my decision. So those were the two schools. I've never once had any regret about my choice to go to Duke. It was a fantastic experience for me. Real briefly on, I wanted to say something about succeeding Coach K, because I agree with you. I think you want to be the guy after the guy that succeeds him. You don't want to be the guy.
It's going to be very difficult to succeed him. You just 5 national championships, 3 gold medals, and so forth. So, but other qualities as well. So it'll be difficult, and the decision will not have to be made for a while. I think Kevin White will ultimately make the decision if Coach K steps down when Kevin's there. But Coach K could last past Kevin White. So we'll see. And anyway, I'm really happy with the fact that Coach K has been able to keep his players kind of as a group. They're really loyal to him. They go back. It's really helped the university to have these players come back and be supportive of the university and not just forget the university. So, but what do you think about my idea that if James Naismith had been Jewish, he would have made the rim at 6 feet so people Jewish could dunk the ball? That's my thought, that he should, it's unfair. I can't dunk the ball. I wish I could, I could get to maybe 6 feet, but 10 feet is a little bit much. Now, were you able to dunk the ball?
This is a sore subject.
This is a sick burn, Tommy. This is a sick burn.
David, you're getting into the
weeds here
of
my emotional. Now, I can still dunk,
Okay.
but I've only had one dunk in the NBA.
Really?
I had one dunk in the NBA. Yeah.
So every time you dunk, you get it in, right? So it's pretty good. So 1,000%.
1,000% on dunks in the NBA. Correct.
So in hindsight, do you think you ever should have made some of those free throws at the end so you could have had the all-time NCAA record on free throws? Do you ever think about that?
I try not to live in the past.
Okay.
For some reason, my senior year, I only shot 87%, and I lost the record. You know,
But do you think if you had tattoos then, you would have been a better shooter? Because you're really great at when you have the tattoos.
Yeah.
So without the tattoos, do you think you would be as good? You would have been as good.
Well, I actually, if you look historically at my shooting percentage from 3-point and from free throw, I think historically speaking, I've been better with an arm sleeve. The year I got my arm sleeve, I led the league in 3-point shooting. Right. It was second last year. So, you look, everybody's like, this guy had a burner at Duke. My shooting percentage in the NBA from 3 is better than it was at Duke, and that's against better defenders.
Well, what did your family say when you got all those tattoos?
They were so first of all, my first tattoo was while I was in college. I got it with my 80-year-old grandmother. It's a very small tattoo right here on my my pectoral muscle. When I decided to get the sleeve, I slow burned it with my mom for about 6 or 7 years. I just kind of kept feeding her these hints that it was happening, so that when I sent her the picture of half of my sleeve done, she wouldn't totally freak out. She kind of knew that it was coming.
Here's what I never understood about tattoos. I don't have any tattoos because I'm afraid of getting tattooed. I'm too old for tattoos maybe. But when you get older, your skin wrinkles, and what are these tattoos going to look like when you're 70 years old?
I've thought about that.
What do you do?
Well, my second tattoo was on my belly. I don't know why I got it there, but afterwards I said to myself, this is motivation to always have a 6-pack. Now, maybe not when I'm 70, but right. It's definitely motivation to stay lean and stay in shape.
So, do you have children?
I do. I have 2 children. Yeah, two boys.
And they came to you and said, Dad, I would like to get a tattoo. What would you say?
When they're old enough to make those decisions, I think they can.
David, there's another factor here you have to consider. So one of JJ and I's friends, another player, Duncan Robinson, he brought this up on the show. He comes on the show with us a lot. Right. He plays for the Heat, is a shooter for the Heat. Duncan asked JJ whether he should get tattoos because he thinks that people will treat him differently if he has them. He thinks that people now think he's, for lack of a better word, soft. And if he doesn't, and if he has tattoos and he looks different, he looks more intimidating. And so there's a gamesmanship element to this as well that is different maybe in basketball than in private equity.
Well, why is it that you can't get tattoos that last for just a year? I mean, a lot of things don't last permanently. Why can't they have tattoos that eventually in a year it'll fade off? That's what they should do. You would think with all the things they can invent in the world, they would have invented that by now.
You can get them lasered off. Off.
That's painful.
It's worse than the actual tattoo. Yeah, right. It's worse. Let's talk briefly about your book specifically. Your newest book, How to Lead. Wisdom from the world's greatest CEOs, founders, and game changers. This book is basically a collection of interviews you've done with business people, philanthropists, politicians, Coach K, and you've broken the book down into sections: visionaries, builders, transformers, commanders, decision makers, masters. This does this curiosity come from? I mean, you just scolded me on my tattoos and interviewed me for the last 5 minutes. No, but where does this intellectual curiosity to ask other people questions, where does this come from?
It's a very good question. There's a Yiddish word called yenta. You probably haven't heard of this word, but yenta means you're a busybody. You want to know everything. And I think when I was little, people come visit my parents. I would always ask questions, and maybe it's a defense mechanism to kind of say, I don't have much to say myself about my own self, so let me ask you about yourself. And I just think it's a way of learning. So I've always been interested in asking people questions, and I enjoy it. And I try to mix in some humor with it as well. And as a result, people seem to like me to do it. So I've been doing it for a while. It's kind of a hobby. I don't know if you're a golfer for a hobby or you have some hobbies. And, for me, it's like a hobby. It's not my main thing, but I do enjoy it. And I find talking with people, you learn a lot. And, it's a way to engage with people in an interesting way. And I would say, as a podcaster, you should realize that the interview format is a relatively new thing. There was no interviews of Shakespeare. We don't have any interviews of Charlemagne. Julius Caesar was never interviewed. It was only really in the early 1950s when there was a television show called The Tonight Show that later evolved into the Jay Leno Show and so forth, where people went on TV and they were interviewed, and it was interviewed as entertainment. And then ultimately it evolved into a format we now have. But I wish I could go back and interview people like Henry VIII, the king of Henry VIII, and say, Henry VIII, why did you not get a prenup agreement as opposed to chopping off the heads of your wives? Or ask Cleopatra. Cleopatra, who was a better lover, Mark Antony or Julius Caesar? Or William Shakespeare? Who really wrote those books, those plays? But, we don't have that. So I just think it's an interesting way to kind of communicate with people. And I think people enjoy hearing frank exchanges, and people in interviews tend to be more frank than if they're just giving a speech.
David, I was going to ask you this. So the guest list, and guys, you should definitely get the book, but then also you can watch a lot of your interviews on YouTube through Bloomberg TV or whatever it is. Your guest list is insane. Like, people say JJ and I have good guests on this show, but yours are on like another stratosphere. It's everybody from like Oprah to Coach K to Phil Knight to, you did one with George W. Bush and Bill Clinton together, or I'm kind of like, how did that? So my question is there anybody you have not been able to get on that you're incredibly curious about? Because it seems like you can basically get whoever you want.
Well, some people are very shy and they don't do interviews very much. Some people, there's a matter of policy. It's hard to get the Queen Elizabeth. I can't get her. The Pope doesn't do a lot of interviews with people's last name is Rubenstein, so I'm probably not going to get him. But I would say most of the people I've interviewed are people I know. So I'm not really calling people cold calls. I've been fortunate to meet a lot of these people in other contexts. Secondly, my interviews are, I'm not 60 Minutes. When you go on 60 Minutes, you might be embarrassed. You're going to be asked a question you don't want to ask. I tell people, I'm not a journalist. I'm not going to embarrass you. And so I ask questions that they're happy with, and they and I have some humor to it. So nobody actually walks away upset. So when the word goes forth, it's not that bad or hard to get interviews with people because they know I'm not going to embarrass them in some ways.
In the introduction, you talk about the sort of your 13 traits of leadership. There's a little bit of overlap from some of these characteristics. If you had to break down into like 3 or 4 of the most important characteristics that you see over and over again in these highly successful, highly driven people you interview.
Hard work. Nobody ever got anywhere working 9 to 5, 5 days a week. Nobody won a Nobel Prize just working 5 days a week. You have to hard work, persistence. When people tell you it's not going to work, you have to persist. You have to fail at something so you learn how to fail, and then you pick yourself up. Also, focus. You have to focus on something. Make yourself a great shooter. Make yourself a great tennis player. Whatever it is, make yourself good at one thing, and then other things will spring from that. Also, I think humility is an important virtue, because when you failed in life, you learn how to be humble. And while Donald Trump would not be seen as a humble person, and I imagine Julius Caesar wasn't humble and Napoleon wasn't humble, most people today, Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos, when you meet with them, they're actually pretty humble. And so I think humility helps. Integrity helps a lot too. And also, in the end, having the ability to communicate with people. The way you influence people is you communicate. You have to communicate by being a good talker, being a good writer, or you lead by example, and you communicate by what you do, and other people will follow you. Those are some of the traits that are the most important to me and I've seen in these people.
The ability to talk to people and interact with people. One of the traits you listed was persuasiveness. I wanted to just ask you specifically about this idea of EQ and emotional intelligence versus IQ, right? And how time and time again we see EQ, especially in group settings, be such a separator for your average leader and a great leader.
Well, think about this. The people running the world are generally not the smartest people in the world. The people running the world, generally, people have a good enough EQ to know how to get along with other people, to convince other people to follow them. When your high school class, I don't know who was the valedictorian of your high school class. Let's assume for a moment you were not the valedictorian. Whatever happened to that valedictorian? Well, you never heard from again. Most people, every high school class and every college class has a first in their class of valedictorian. Most of those people fade into the woodwork. It's the people that have the ability to get along with people, that know how to have an emotional intelligence and EQ. That's really much more important than IQ. It's good to be smart, but being too smart is not great. I've hired geniuses over the years, and they never work out. They're too complicated. They can't tie their shoelaces. They might be great on SAT tests, but they can't get along with people. So EQ is much more important in my view than IQ.
I feel like there's a constant challenge, though, as a leader when it comes to ego, confidence, humility, like finding that balance, especially if you're really good at something, and not that all great leaders don't work hard, but sometimes you're really good at something naturally, and something comes easy to you. And so, I deal with this in my profession all the time, where we have really outstanding players, really outstanding coaches, but so often in the group format, egos can really get in the way.
Well, ego, everybody has an ego, and I think the best thing to do is to try to sublimate it, because you have much more influence if you are humble, and if you're not humble, I tell people to fake it. You can fake being humble. It's much better to fake being humble than to be arrogant. And arrogance doesn't get you very far, in my view. Now, in the athletic world, it's different. You're dealing with, to be serious, younger people. Somebody in their 20s is going to be less able to be humble than maybe somebody who's 50 and 60 and lived longer. Humility is, if you're LeBron James and your whole life has been people telling you how great you are, you've never experienced real failure, it may be harder to be humble, though I think he's not as arrogant as I would be. If I had his skills, I would be very arrogant, I'm sure. But as a general rule of thumb, the people that you most admire, I suspect, are people that are humble. The people that are arrogant and telling you how great they are, they're not the people you most admire. And the people that are going to get along in the world are going to be the people that have more humility. The trick, and you have, as and all professional athletes have, is that for the first half of your life, people think you walk on water. And if you're an NBA star, you walk on water more than anybody else. Okay. But what do you do with the second half of your life? Most people in the NBA, most NBA players average, 3 or 4 or 5 years in the NBA or something like that. So you're different. But very few people make 20 years in the NBA, but a couple have, and some have made 21 or 22 years. That's very rare. But what do you do when you're 40 years old? In my profession, 40 years old is a teenager. I have young people, they're 38, 37. I say they're nice, but they got to mature a little bit. So it's the people that are running the world usually are people in their 40s and 50s and 60s. So you, as a professional athlete, you have a much bigger challenge. You figured out how to deal with the first half of your life. You're very successful. The trick is, how do you make the second half of your life as enjoyable? Now, some athletes have done it. Some professional athletes have been spectacular in the second half of your life. I would say Roger Staubach is a good example. Built a great business, great many different ways. Some people, Johnny Unitas, who was my hero growing up, he never figured out how to be a great post-football player. He had a complicated life afterwards, never really amounted to that much after football. So it's a big trick, figuring out how to be successful after you've been an athletic star for your whole life and people telling you how great you are, and you have to start all over again. As you know, I'm sure you've thought about it. What do you do in the second half of your life? You want to be an NBA coach? You want to be an NBA general manager, or do you want to go into a different world and say, look, I'm going to be in real estate, I'm going to be in private equity? It's not easy to figure that out for people, and it's challenging.
Where do I submit my resume to the Carlyle Group?
Right. Well, you would be.
Is there a way?
Look, obviously you're extremely well known, and if you said you were going to spend your rest of your life being a basketball coach, basketball general manager, people would say that makes sense, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you said, I'm going to learn how to be a private equity person and maybe make staggering amounts of money, people would say, why is he doing that? Because he's got to learn something all over, start at the bottom. But in the end, if you do those kind of things, you can make much more of yourself in life, in my view. In my view, like, for example, in my generation, the superstar was a guy named Bill Bradley. You may or may not know. But remember, he was an NBA player, Princeton All-American. But he retransformed himself into a public figure and made himself a basketball player. Made himself a United States senator and then a presidential candidate. Now he's an investment banker. But those transitions are hard to do.
David, you live this transition though. We talk about the pivot, right? Right. You made a couple pivots early in your professional life. You started out as a lawyer, you worked in the White House, and then you launched this private equity firm in DC, which nobody thought was going to be successful. And I feel like this is a recurring theme amongst leaders, is just the ability to recognize how dynamic life can be and to be able to shift gears in a really easy way, and not be discouraged necessarily if one of those shifts doesn't pan out the way they thought it was going to pan out?
There are two people who dropped out of Harvard and became very successful, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, but they cannot be anybody's role models. Those are 1 in a billion situation. The general person in life, the average person, has several different careers and several different jobs, and you have to figure out which one makes you the most successful. In the end, people are successful if they enjoy what they do. I didn't like practicing law. I loved the White House, but then we got voted out. So I loved building a business from scratch. And then when I made a lot of money, I loved giving it away. And so I've given away, a large amount of money so far. I intend to give away a couple billion more. And I enjoy doing that, but I got lucky in life, and maybe I made some of my luck, but I got lucky. I would say basketball players and professional athletes have a harder choice in life because their second half of their life generally is not going to be as successful as their first half unless they make some changes in the way they think about what they want out of life. In your case, you could coast the rest of your life as the great J.J. Redick, and you could be a coach or a manager or a scout or a commentator on TV. There's nothing wrong with that. That won't be as transformative, and you won't be as influential in the world as if you become you build your own private equity firm, or you become a tech CEO or something.
David, I was going to ask you about the difference in your mind between, going back to humility for a second, between humility and confidence, especially now. And part of what I was going to ask is, take politics out of it, take Trump out of it, but with things like social media and just kind of the way our instant gratification society works, if there's someone listening to this how do they make sure everybody knows they're doing a good job without being like braggadocio about it?
John Kennedy, as president of the United States, was a self-confident man. Why? He was from a wealthy family. He was handsome, had a gorgeous wife. Everything went well. He was president of the United States, and he's 43. He could afford to make jokes about himself, so-called self-deprecating humor. And it worked wonderfully because he was secure. Donald Trump cannot make jokes about himself because he's not that secure. The only time I've seen him try to make a joke, it was a disaster at a Washington event. He said, "There's my wife over there, Melania. A lot of people are leaving the White House. They're getting fired. She might get fired too." Now, that's a joke about his wife. That's not a self-deprecating joke, but he thought that was self-deprecating. He's not secure enough to be self-deprecating. But when you, in my early days, I was not, wealthy. I wasn't rich. I wasn't handsome. I wasn't a great athlete. I was nothing. So I probably wasn't so good at self-deprecating humor. Now I'm better at it because I have a lot of self-confidence. I know when I make a speech, I know I can give a speech for an hour and, without notes. I know how to do this very well, or I know how to do interviews pretty well. So I have a lot of confidence in my ability, so I can afford to be self-deprecating. The balance is, if you are not sure of yourself and you don't have confidence, and you might be more arrogant. But I think confidence is something that you get over a period of time. So when J.J. Redick is on the basketball court, he has a lot of confidence. If I said, "J.J., look, why don't you come to Carlyle and we'll talk about how to make a good private equity investment. I'll give you an investment committee memo, and when you present on what you think are the strengths of this 500-page investment committee memo," he's not going to be self-confident, I suspect.
You don't know. You don't know.
You might be, and maybe you know more about investments than I presumed. And there's nothing, investments are not that complicated, believe me. It's not. There are a lot of people who are making a lot of money in the investment world are not that smart. So it's not that challenging to do. It's just a matter of hard work. But look, in your own case, you're in your 30-something, right? You're 30 what?
6. I'm 36.
36. Okay. As I said in my book, I read that entrepreneurs start their companies by the age of 37. So if you're going to do something, 37 is a good age. But if at 36, 37, 38, you're an old man in the athletic world. You're a teenager in the business world. So you have a chance to start all over again. And the dilemma you face, and I think I would put it this way, is do you want to be J.J. Redick, the great basketball player, the rest of your life, or start another life where 10 or 20 years from now, people say, "Oh, he did play basketball. I didn't know that. He's made $1 billion in something else. He may have played basketball. I didn't know they did that." Maybe you want to do that. Maybe you're happy you can be a basketball person for the rest of your life. It's easier to do that, probably.
Yeah, it would be easier, I presume. There certainly is an appeal in the challenge, an appeal in the idea of doing something outside of the game. I think it's difficult for any athlete, right? Because you're over the course of any person's career, if you start out in the financial world and you spend 10 to 15 years in that world, what are you doing? You're building equity in your professional craft. And it's the same way in basketball. We've all spent 20 or 30 years since the time we were kids building equity in our sport and learning the nuances and essentially becoming geniuses and really intelligent in that sport. And then all of a sudden it's like you can't play anymore. Sorry, you got to go do something else. So I think it's very easy to understand why an athlete would sort of gravitate towards doing something within the sport.
I see, but I don't really know you. I'd never met you before, but you're obviously articulate, and so you're obviously, in my view, a pretty smart guy. So you obviously would have the gray matter and the presence to be able to do a transformation. Maybe you go to a business school, or maybe you get an internship at a private equity firm and all those kind of things. You would be very impressive in lots of parts of the business world if you say that's what I want to do. But for the first 2 or 3 years, it's going to be a bit of a struggle. And people are going to say, what's he doing here? And is he really serious about it? And, you can say, look, I'm just going to be a coach, assistant coach, or I'm going to coach the Duke team or something like that. But in the end, whatever makes you happy. Thomas Jefferson said that the life is about the pursuit of happiness, but he never told us what happiness is. And the most elusive thing in life is personal happiness. Most people do not achieve it. You may be very happy now, and you're probably, your situation is probably you're figuring out what you're going to do the rest of your life, because you got 40, 50 years ahead of you, and what are you going to do? And so that's probably the biggest angst you would probably have. How much longer can you play basketball? You probably can't do it for more than 2 or 3 or 4 years, I guess.
David, when did you find personal happiness?
When I agreed to say I was going to do this podcast. I said,
that was it.
I don't know, JJ Redick. I'm going to do a podcast with JJ Redick. That's going to be my personal happiness. I tell you, to be very serious about it, I came from a poor family, and I worked my way up, and I got lucky in life and so forth. So when I started giving away large sums of money, I felt much happier. I was contributing to the country. When my mother would call me up and say, David, you're doing something useful with your life by giving away money, I was happy. And of course I have 3 children, and they're now all in pretty good shape. So I'm happy when your children are your ultimate legacy. But, look, when I graduated from Duke, if you had asked people in the class who was going to be the chairman of the board from Duke University in 25 years or so, nobody would have picked me. I don't think most people in my class even knew I was in the class. So and so to come back and be the alma mater, the chairman of the board of trustees, your alma mater is pretty happy. I'm about to be the chairman of the board of the law school I went to, the University of Chicago. So that's happiness. So I'm chairman of a lot of other things. I enjoy it, but I mostly, I've gotten to the point where I love everything I'm doing. I just wish I was younger. So I would give up all the money I have and everything I have now if I could be 1 year younger, because I would live longer. But, you can't do that in life.
A few years ago when I played for the Clippers, I got the chance to spend a bunch of time with Steve Ballmer. And he's another guy that is a lifelong learner and loves to ask questions. And he would ask basketball questions. I would ask him other questions. And one of the things I remember him talking to me about was how him and Connie were trying to figure out how to give away their money, and how it was a little more challenging to figure out. He wanted to do it the right way. He wanted it to be efficient. He wanted that money to be used in a way that was gonna benefit society at large, but also something that he was passionate about. And it was a challenge. How did you decide what you were gonna give to?
Okay, I'll talk about that. On Steve, I do know Steve. Maybe not as well as you do. I've interviewed him a couple of times. He has a much bigger problem when you talk to him. When he left Microsoft, his net worth was roughly $13 billion. $13 billion. Today, it's roughly $80 billion. So giving away $80 billion when he's probably 65 years old or something like that. So it's not that easy to do. It's a big challenge. What I did is this. I decided I had the standards. One, I wanted to do something that I could start something that wouldn't otherwise get started, finish something that wouldn't otherwise get finished, do something where I would see the progress of it and the benefit of it in my lifetime. And 3, I have an intellectual interest in it so that I would want to stay involved with it, and then may have some connection to part of my life, like Duke University or University of Chicago or Harvard or something like that. So that's my standards. And I got involved in many different things, and I just enjoy what I'm doing. But I mostly make all the decisions myself. I don't have a staff. I know what I want to do. And I want to fix the Washington Monument. I want to fix the Lincoln Memorial. I just go ahead and put up the money and do it. So it's just things I'm interested in, I guess, in some ways.
I assume you've obviously heard of Malcolm Gladwell, but did you read the book Outliers?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the chapters in that book is about how Bill Gates and Paul Allen, the reason they were able to sort of get ahead in the computer coding world is because they had access to a computer when not a lot of people had access to a computer. When you look at sort of the big private equity firms, whether it's Apollo or KKR or Carlyle Group, Steve Schwartzman's group, like they were all sort of started around the same time.
Right, that's right.
Late 80s, early 90s. What was it about that? And you talk a lot in your book about luck, and so do the people you interview. What was it about that specific time period that was able to sort of give rise to this catastrophic creation of wealth?
Well, a couple of things. In each of these cases, there are different situations, but all of them were situations where there had been a few buyouts that were done, and a couple of them that were done early on made a lot of money. And people realized that you could make a lot of money if you knew what you're doing. And the reason you can make money in buyouts is basically this. In those days, you could borrow 95% of the purchase price. And so you put up 5% of the money and you borrow 95%. Well, if things work out, you pay back the 95%, you made a staggering amount of money. So the leverage was staggering. Secondly, you get 20% of the profits. In most areas of money management, you get a management fee of 1% or less. Here you got 20% of the profits. So you can make staggering amounts of wealth. And so people were attracted to that because other parts of what they were doing in their life weren't quite as profitable. And in the end, we all came to do this in different backgrounds. I came from government. Steve was an investment banker. I think the other guys had been investment bankers as well. But it took off a bit. And nobody would have predicted that these firms would become that big. They all thought that they would be small firms. They just grew. When KKR did the famous RJR deal in 1989, they only had 7 people in the firm. They were tiny firms. I came along and, among other things, said, why don't we build out a family of funds and then globalize the business? And we made it more of an institutional business than it had been before. They were very small firms.
Speaking of institutions, I want to talk a little bit, because we've talked about this on the podcast before with different guests, but we want to talk a little bit about disinformation. And I read both parts of the interview with Fauci in the book, and we all have seen him a ton over the last 6 to 8 months. But we're living in a time period where there's so much disinformation, and the credibility of our institutions are constantly being scrutinized and questioned. We recently had John Brennan on, who was the ex-CIA director, and the comment sections wasn't great. It wasn't great. We recognize that the CIA is not perfect, but it is a legitimate institution that hopefully is working in the best interest of America, right? So in this age of misinformation and doubting the credibility and doubting the expertise of leaders, and even someone like Anthony Fauci, who's dedicated his life to the public good, how hard is it? Is it harder now than it's ever been to be a leader?
Well, it's hard in some sense because there's much more competition. Everybody wants to be a leader. Everybody's trying to compete with you. There's much more competition. And also getting your message out there may be harder because there's so many other people communicating. In the old days, you might have had newspapers. You could just talk to the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, and then you're done. Now you have social media and cable TV and so many other things. So to get your message out takes a lot more time. But there's always going to be people rising up. Dealing with disinformation is a challenge because there's an incentive to provide disinformation. There's no penalty for providing disinformation. If you lie about something, nobody's going to jail for lying. If you come up with a conspiracy theory, say Barack Obama is not born in the United States, people say, well, maybe you're right. Maybe, there's a lot of people willing to accept disinformation because there's a natural tendency on some people's part to believe the worst about certain people. And if they can get some disinformation about it, it feeds their own prejudices or their own views. So I would say, disinformation is increasingly a problem because if you get more information coming in, how do you filter it? In the old days, you could read the New York Times or the Washington Post or some other paper, and you'd figure out that they were probably going to be honest, generally speaking. Now you have so many sources feeding information that it's hard for an average citizen to know what's honest and what's not honest. So in the sports world, for example, you probably read a lot about yourself, and it's an interesting phenomenon.
To some degree, I do. I do.
So think about this. When I am involved with something and it goes into the newspapers, I say they're completely wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. They didn't call me. And this is just all wrong. And so, but when you read about something you don't know anything about, you say, well, it must be accurate. It's in the New York Times. So it's an interesting phenomenon that people know. When you know the facts, you know it's wrong. But then when you don't know the facts, you think it's right. It's just surprising that's the way it works. So I'm sure you've read articles about yourself. You say they don't know what they're talking about. They didn't call you. But then you go read an article about LeBron James and you'd say, well, it must be true. They wouldn't have written it if it wasn't true. But it's just a strange way that the human brain works.
That is actually, I've never really thought about that before, but you're so right. And not just in reading about myself, but
the ecosystem is.
If I'm an expert on the NBA and I read something and I'll be like, man, they're off on that. They're off on that. If I have some level of inside knowledge.
Yeah, they do this with trade rumors. They do it with player movement. They do it with coaches. They do the rumor mill in general. It's just a part of the ecosystem. There's no one checking to make sure these things are right. And especially now with no barrier to entry, anybody can be an expert if they put the right heading around themselves.
Well, people like rumors because people like to know what's happening, and they want to know what's happening before it happens. So people have a predisposition to say, well, I just heard about this. It must be true. Why do you think it's not true? They say it's true. But even though, they don't really have any basis for knowing whether it's true. If it's in a newspaper, they think it might be true.
Another thing I wanted to bring up with you, David, in the conversation you had with Warren Buffett, he talks about this a little bit, and I think this is the case with some of your other interviews, about a chip on his shoulder. And just remembering people in his past that maybe dismissed him or wronged him or whatever it may be. We talk about this with players all the time, and a lot of the best players in the NBA, and they've talked about it on the show, they have these various things that motivate them. And even when they get to a place where, they're scoring 25 points a game and making a ton of money and all these different things, they still have the chip on your shoulder. Is that a common theme that you see with people you talk to, is having sort of that specific individual motivating factor, maybe from their past?
Motivate. Well, I think many people want to please their parents. Many people want to show their high school classmates who didn't treat them well, hey, I'm really better than you thought I was. Many people, people want to be successful as a general rule of thumb. People don't want to be unsuccessful, and people generally take pride in doing something successful. So yeah, there's a big motivation to kind of prove that you're good and you're worth what you're doing on the face of the earth. We don't know why we're on the face of the earth. There's 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth. What are we doing here? What's our purpose? Nobody really knows. But presumably, people think that there's some value to doing something useful that pleases other people. So you're a professional basketball player. Why are you a professional basketball player? Well, you get compensated for it, but it pleases other people. If people booed every time you went on the court and people hated you for being a professional basketball player, you might be less disposed to do it. So people want to please other people to the extent it's possible. That's what life is generally about, is trying to please other people. It's not always easy to do, though.
My first few years at Duke, when I was getting ridiculed every time we went on the road, I legitimately thought about quitting. I didn't want to play, as this is not sort of the experience that I wanted for myself. And then I also I got booed at home last couple years when I played in Philadelphia. They're a little hard on their athletes.
Why was that? Is that because of Philadelphia or what?
It's just Philadelphia. Yeah, it's just part of the deal there. You just accept it.
They were a really good team. They were a crazy bounce away from winning a championship, and they still booed them at home.
Yeah, well, they made a mistake in trading you, right?
They didn't re-sign me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they regret it, right?
Well, yeah. I'm going to tell you this story. I haven't told this story. So I went on a different podcast a couple weeks ago, and they asked me about not re-signing. And I said on the podcast, they fucked up by not re-signing me. What people don't understand is 5 minutes prior to that, I was on a information gathering phone call with someone in their front office, asking me about a coach. And at the end of the call, they said, we fucked up in not re-signing you. So I was just relaying the information that they gave me.
Right. Well, look, but of all the basketball players you played with, the person has the greatest physical skills. Is that Zion Williamson, or he has very unique but not the greatest physical skills?
It's a great question. Zion or Blake or Joel or Dwight. Those would be the four. Blake Griffin,
Zion, Joel Embiid,
Dwight Howard, and Blake Griffin. Is there anyone else, Tommy, that I've played with?
I think Ben Simmons. I think Ben Simmons has incredible physical skills, and he's scratching the surface potential-wise of what he.
But like LeBron James, you've played against LeBron James. Is he the greatest player you played against?
Yes, and I think he's 1A or 1B in the conversation of greatest of all time. But he's the best player I played against.
And the greatest shooter you've ever seen, other than yourself, would that be Curry?
Steph Curry, yes. I can I'm not even going to say it because I've said this before. I can objectively say I'm in the conversation of like, call it like top 10 to 15 best, but I'm not in the top 5. I'm nowhere near the top 5.
I thought about your shooting though when we were reading the book, David, because the singular focus thing is a perfect example of, when JJ or Duncan or Clay or Steph or any of these guys who are the best shooters in the league, when they can do this thing better than anybody else, they're always going to have a spot, no matter what. Before we let you go, David, I have one last specific question I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
There, a large part of our populace is probably uncomfortable with women in leadership. And are there characteristics that you've seen that women leaders have, or that women leaders do better than men?
Well, women in rising up in business have challenges because it's basically a male-dominated world in business. So before I did this, I just interviewed Julie Sweet, who runs Accenture, but she's one of only 15 women running Fortune 500 companies, and it's very rare. So women have a challenge of what do you do with a family? Do you ignore having children? Do you ignore being married? Do you work as hard as your male cohorts? Do you have to deal with what you wear, your dress, and the way you look? It's a bit different kind of situation. And people will always think that in this day and age, you got where you are because of affirmative action. So it's much more challenging being a woman rising up, and very challenging being an African-American rising up. There's no doubt about it. And women have different skill sets. I think they're much better in EQ than men are, for sure. Absolutely. And they may be better in IQ too. But it's much more difficult. If you have 500 companies in the Fortune 500 and 15 are run by women, that tells you it's not that easy to rise up. And some of the women in my book that I wrote about, they had no children, or they had a husband who basically took care of the kids. So trying to take care of the kids and run a company and be successful and travel around the world, not easy to do.
Yeah. David, we really appreciate the time.
Oh, here's the only thing I'd like to say.
Yeah.
So sometime I would like, I have a home in Nantucket that some people say is the best home in Nantucket, and has a basketball court in it. And sometime I'd like to kind of challenge my neighbors. And can you wander up? I'll invite you. You wander up, and I'll just say, I'll just take this guy. He's just walking around here, and you could be my partner, and we could play, horse or something. I'd never win horse, but with you, I think I could win.
If you send the invite, I promise you I will come to Nantucket.
All right.
And I'll be on your team.
Okay. We're going to come and we're going to film it.
All right, good. Okay, so I'm going to finally win a horse game. Thanks a lot. Yeah. I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah. Thank you, David. We appreciate it.
Right.
All right.
Thanks, David.
Bye.